Welcome back, everyone, to the fourth episode of Everywhere with CRE2, a new podcast produced by the Center for the Study of Race, Ethnicity, and Equity at Washington University in St. Louis. In each episode, we delve into path-breaking research, innovative learning opportunities, and strategic engagement to better understand how race and ethnicity are integral to the most complex and challenging issues of our present and past. So good morning, I'm William Acree with CRE2 and the host for this episode, and I'm so grateful to have with us for the conversation Professor Geoff Ward and Dr. Kelly Schmidt. So Geoff is the director of the WashU Slavery Project and professor of African and African American Studies at Washington University, where he holds affiliate appointments with the American Culture Studies Program and Sociology. His research focuses on the history and legacies of racial violence, and he's the author of the award-winning book, The Black Child Savers, Racial Democracy and Juvenile Justice. And he's been developing some really innovative public-facing projects that include the Racial Violence Archive and Monumental Anti-Racism. And Dr. Kelly Schmidt completed her PhD in Public History and U.S. History at Loyola University Chicago and recently joined the WashU Slavery Project. Dr. Schmidt specializes in African American history with a focus on slavery, racism, abolition, and resistance, and she brings extensive knowledge and experience related to the history of enslavement in St. Louis and the wider Mississippi and Ohio valleys, including how it relates to higher education institutions. So good to have both of you with us this morning for this episode. So let's dive in, right? So what is USS, University Studying Slavery, and what's the background, right, to launching the WashU Slavery Project?
Well, I'll start, Billy, first by thanking you for inviting us to participate in the podcast. And I'll start with an answer to that question, but I think Kelly has some useful, broader perspective on University Studying Slavery. The short answer is that this is a consortium of universities, mostly in the United States, and not exclusively universities, academic institutions, primarily universities, also libraries and museums, that have committed to examining how their institutional histories are entangled with the history and legacy of slavery, and have committed to addressing some of those entanglements in terms of contemporary issues of inequality related to the legacy of slavery. So in most cases, these institutions, I think, begin with, an investigation of their origin stories and what's often been left out of those stories, particularly as relates to slavery. But the projects really differ tremendously. And I think there are 80 or so institutions engaged in the consortium at this point. And they all have sort of stories unto themselves in terms of how their projects have taken shape. In terms of how we got started, the WashU Slavery Project originates really in a conversation with the chancellor in the wake of the George Floyd and Breonna Taylor and other killings, as institutions began to really grapple with this question of what more they can do to dismantle structural racism. Chancellor Martin invited a number of scholars who focus on race at WashU and to talk with him about their ideas in terms of what more we could do besides, diversify our student body and hire more faculty focused on these issues, besides launching the Center for the Study of Race, Ethnicity, and Equity. And in that conversation, I suggested that we join University Studying Slavery, mostly so that we could build into the fabric of the institution opportunities for all of our students and faculty and staff to grapple with these kinds of questions, which are more typically the kinds of things that are only encountered in a handful of courses, in select departments, and in the occasional speaker or conference event or other programming. And so the idea was that we could build the capacity to sustain this kind of reflection indefinitely by joining University Studying Slavery, by learning more about our foundational story and the story of the legacy of slavery for our university and community through this initiative. And finally, that in doing so, we could position WashU as a stronger partner in this work of reckoning in St. Louis and in the wider region, nation, and world. So that was the vision for really why we should get started with this project. But I want to invite my colleague Kelly to say more about University Studying Slavery and what's going on there.
Yeah, and thanks, Billy, for having us. It's great to be here. I think Geoff said it so well in describing universities studying slavery as really a network to help universities collaborate in this work of understanding more fully their entanglements with slavery and racism and how we make those known and respond to them and address their legacies today. It's a place where colleges and universities can come together to discuss and determine best practices, work through challenges. And I had the privilege of being able to be part of this group close to its founding. I believe it was founded in 2016 by the University of Virginia. And at first, it only included Virginia colleges and universities. But then, maybe within the year or a year or so thereafter, Georgetown University petitioned to join the group to be able to build understanding of how they should address their knowledge that they were involved in the sale of more than 272 enslaved people in 1838. And once Georgetown joined, the consortium decided to start inviting universities from all over the country. And now it's become an even global effort with universities and colleges from all over the world participating. And it's been really interesting to see how it's evolved. So at the beginning, the group was really small, and we had opportunities to be hosted by different universities and learn about the projects they're engaging in to address these histories and legacies. And we had breakout groups to work on specific topics or challenges or goals, such as community engagement, working to gain support from administration, exhibits and memorialization, doing historical research methodologies, how do we begin engaging in repair work, reparations, building digital archives, and addressing current campus climates with students, faculty, and staff. And since then, it's grown into a full-blown conference that has panels and participants from all over the country, some associated with universities and some not. And there's still small USS member meetings where they work through some of these questions and challenges and also work on joint efforts together, such as a partnership between formerly enslaving institutions and HBCUs to build support for HBCUs going forward.
Yeah, that's great. I mean, thank you both so much for delving into sort of the backstory of USS and the connection of WashU to the consortium. I remember the news coming out about Georgetown joining. Must have been several years ago, right? And like you said, Kelly, since 2016, the number of institutions who've become members of the consortium it's grown really rapidly, right? To now, like Geoff was saying, close to or more than 80. And I just saw the news, I guess it was recently, about the 2023 conference in Nova Scotia, which is that's going to be the first one held in Canada, if I'm remembering correctly about that.
Yeah, the first one held outside of the United States, I believe.
Yeah.
And that's, to Kelly's point about this really tremendous growth and enthusiasm around this initiative. I think we should expect to see that continue, and there will be more transnational kinds of engagements with these questions over the years to come.
Yeah. I want to come back quickly, Geoff, to what you're talking about with the sort of the initial vision for the WashU and Slavery Project, and the emphasis on research and learning opportunities in this first phase of the work, right? Including student research and creative work. And especially, I think you started to highlight partnerships across campus, as well as across St. Louis. So I didn't Didn't know if you wanted to just expand on that a little bit, talk a bit more about the type of student research, creative work that you're hoping to facilitate and promote, and the partnerships too across the university.
Sure. Well, I think one place to start here in terms of thinking about the opportunities we have is just to reflect on WashU's presence in the Mississippi River Valley and how deeply this institution and this region are connected to the stories of settler colonialism and the stories of enslavement and the struggle for freedom and so on. So I think in that broadest sense, WashU, as a major research university in this region, has the potential to contribute a great deal to our understanding not only of St. Louis history, but of our national story as relates to things like slavery and higher education. The positioning of our institution geographically and in relation to these questions is a big part of why I wanted to come here 3 years ago or so to continue my work you mentioned on histories and legacies of racial violence, and it's part of why it occurred to me to recommend that we take this opportunity to join the consortium and engage our campus community in this work, but also engage with partners. In terms of these partnerships, as Kelly mentioned, we're sort of late to the dance here. A number of institutions have been doing this work, including in our own neighborhood here in St. Louis, have been doing this work for some time. But other institutions around the country have been doing this work for, I think going on 2 decades now. And one of the greatest elements of the University Studying Slavery Consortium is that we can learn from each other about how to pursue this work. How can we engage our campuses productively and creatively, not only in asking the questions, but in processing the historical trauma and pursuing remedy. What are some promising practices? What are some ways that projects have gone wrong or under realize the potential of this work? And so we're partnering in that sense with the whole consortium. And this is one reason why people, if you go to the project website, you'll see events announced that are not here in St. Louis, are not on our campus. They are in Nova Scotia or in North Carolina. And the point there is to really engage the community in the work of the whole consortium. To the extent people are interested in participating in a symposium. Most of them right now, unfortunately, are virtual. The upside of which is that we can all go. But in terms of local partnerships, also, I was really thrilled that Kelly was available to join us as a postdoc as we were getting started, because she, has just tremendous research experience and also public history and digital humanities experience that is just going to be, has already been quite valuable to the development of the project. But I was also excited because, one of my goals in this first phase of the project is that we prioritize partnership with regional institutions, including area universities, but also museums and archives and libraries who we can work with in the research, but also in the public programming, and the various ways we engage the broader community in grappling with these issues. And so, finally, related to that, I think there are a number of opportunities for our students, and we're starting to see these kind of take off. And I expect this is just going to accelerate as we get into the next semester. But we're already seeing just, really important research by our students involved in the project who are looking into the foundations of the institution and various stories. But we're also beginning to engage students in more creative work around these around these issues. Things, and we could talk more about some of this perhaps in a moment. Work with the museums and the libraries, and including Missouri Historical Society. So I'll just give you one concrete example of what this partnership looks like, and then I'll let Kelly jump in. But we are beginning to research what a tour might look like. A tour on enslavement and its wake in St. Louis might look like. How would we approach that? Where would the tour focus on, and what would be some key places for people to visit? This is, students are involved in researching these kinds of questions, but there will also be opportunities to engage students as guides on these tours, and not only our own students, but students who work with Missouri Historical Society through UMSL's Museum Studies program, for example, potentially, high school students who could participate in the tour, also help lead it. So that's an example of programming that we're anticipating in the future that will be collaborative in many ways, but will also engage our students and other students in this work we want to do together.
Yeah, that sounds fabulous. Sounds like a great outreach initiative and way of connecting our students with St. Louis region communities. Kelly, can we talk a little bit more about WashU's unique position here? I guess opportunities that we have within this regional landscape, and I'm thinking specifically too of your own research, right, and expertise on enslavement and the Mississippi, Ohio river valleys, and areas that you're eager to help build out. Just sort of go back to the point Geoff was making about what we can do as an institution within sort of the regional landscape and the contributions we can make to the consortium.
Sure. So I think something that really stood out to me as Geoff was talking is that slavery as an institution didn't operate in isolation. So you can't isolate Washington University's historical ties to slavery from that of the city, from that of the state, from that of investments in the area, from that of St. Louis University, and of individual enslavers. So I think that's why building these regional collaborations is so important, because the history is intertwined and our responses need to be intertwined too. And we can build energy around that collaborative work without having to reinvent the wheel in each of our institutional pockets. I was even struck by, just prior to this conversation, Geoff was showing me probably an 1840s-ish document from St. Louis University's medical school, and all of the leaders who were involved in the medical school at the time. And they had people listed on them like William Greenleaf Eliot and James H. Lucas, who founded WashU's law department, and several other people who went on to found Washington University, who we know held people in slavery. So that's just one example of these entanglements that pull us all together and will lead us to having to reckon with this together.
Yeah, that's great. I'm just thinking too of of your own research in areas where you see sort of this intersection of your research interests with some of the strategic goals of the project at this point in terms of regional focus.
Yeah, so some initial work I'm doing right now is just bringing the knowledge I built into the project. Prior to being part of the team, I did a series of tweets on St. Louis street names that have ties to slavery. And so I'm combing through all that research and looking through WashU's histories and bringing in everything we know about all these enslavers who were integral to St. Louis and learning about how they shaped the university, and writing up some pieces that we can share on our website soon to show how all these ties fit together.
Yeah, that sounds great too. Can we come back then to to some of the student work, Geoff, that you were mentioning and the connections to museums, or I guess some creative work that students are doing. There was a piece that came out recently in Student Life, right, our student newspaper, from a course that was taught this past semester, some student research on William Greenleaf Eliot, right? Do you want to talk a little bit more about the student research that's happening right now, and we'll run with that?
Sure. Yeah. I mean, the piece you're referring to came out in the November issue of Student Life, titled "WashU's Founder Was Not an Abolitionist. Who Was?" William Greenleaf Eliot. And I invite listeners to read the piece. It's a really richly layered piece, difficult to summarize, mostly about Eliot's mischaracterization as an abolitionist, and the importance of recognizing him as a complex figure who was certainly not simply opposed, and certainly not radically opposed, to the institution of slavery, and asked a number of questions about what it means for the institution to have not only to have been founded by figures like Eliot and co-founder Wayman Crowe and others, O'Fallon and so on, who were invested in the institution and the racial politics of slavery. But what does it mean for us to have misrepresented this past as an institution, and what do we gain from a more honest account of our origins? And I think the piece raises a number of questions that aren't answered yet, and this group of authors continues to investigate some of these questions. I mean, there are in terms of their ongoing work, I think it would be great if the CRE2 podcast and had an episode with this group and just got into some of these issues in more depth with them. There are other students who've been involved in research, various sorts. I mean, I teach a class called Monumental Anti-Racism, where one of the modules in the class, it looks at universities studying slavery as an anti-racist commemorative intervention, and ask students to develop case studies of, how different universities, they're invited to choose from the numerous examples, are particularly approaching the collective memory work. Like, how are they using things like memorials and place renaming and monuments and other commemorative objects to facilitate this work? And I learn a lot with my students through that project, through that class, and in their studies of universities studying slavery. There's another student who's working with our historic cemeteries working group to examine who's been doing, in fact, this student, Allura Berry, began working with me in monumental anti-racism 2 years ago as a first-year student. This is a first-year seminar for here, and her project in that class was a digital virtual tour of St. Charles that recovers the memory of Archer Alexander. She's from St. Charles, African-American woman, and is attempting to counter the erasure of Alexander in St. Charles, emphasizing how people like her, as growing up in St. Charles, would be empowered by the story of Archer Alexander. And so she's trying to counter that through her digital work, her digital virtual tour. But now she's working with WashU Slavery to research Alexander's burial place in St. Peter's Cemetery, which is just maybe 5 miles north of WashU's Danforth campus. Archer Alexander, formerly enslaved in St. Charles, became connected to William Greenleaf Eliot. And we've told this Eliot Alexander story as an institution for many years, but he's buried now in an unmarked grave in St. Peter's, Alexander is. And we're just beginning the process of one, attempting to work with the family, the descendants of Archer Alexander, to place a memorial to Archer Alexander, possibly in St. Peter's Cemetery, and also to hopefully add Archer Alexander's burial place to the Network to Freedom program of the National Park Service, which recognizes sites of significance to the story of the struggle for freedom in the United States, and particularly in relation to the Underground Railroad, but more generally, freedom from enslavement. So this is a project where, Alora is working with us now, and we think other students might become involved in research around this case and others.
The project just launched last spring, right? So we're talking, and it's very early stages, and I'm sure that more courses will be on the books come this coming spring semester. More students will be engaged through those courses, as well as through the programming, events, activities that the project continues to develop. So I expect that a lot of students will be eager to participate in all these kinds of opportunities to advance the work. I wanted to ask a little bit more about, this research on foundational figures or particular ties that they had, or schools or the university had, with slavery and the politics of freedom, or legacies of enslavement, because oftentimes it's really complex work. I think, as the article that we've been talking about in Student Life exemplifies, right? At times it's difficult to carry out because of limited sources or limited access to these sources. The politics surrounding specific people or histories can be complex, to put it mildly. And the lack of nuance or complexity that we often see in public debate about the past today is, I think, a real concern that scholars, students have when we face sort of the challenges of doing this type of work. And so I wanted to ask both of you if you could just talk through a little bit about how this research can help generate some difficult though necessary conversations, and how this work can contribute to reckoning and redress, right? That's sort of at the heart of one of the major goals of WashU and slavery.
Sure. So I think a big challenge in the research I've been doing, up to this point researching the history of the Catholic Church and slavery in the United States, is how do we reckon with people who are revered leaders in our country, who are revered religious figures, who are also enslavers, who exploited people, who manipulated people, who tortured people. We are learning so much that in the Catholic Church, there are many people that we've revered as saints who are also enslavers. And how do you reckon with that? How do you begin to grapple with someone who you've put on a pedestal, who is in fact a lot more complicated? And I think we see that at WashU with the article the students have put out about William Greenleaf Eliot, who we've always praised as this great emancipator, but in fact has a much more complex story, that he was a more moderate abolitionist, that he was purchasing people in order to free them, but they may have had to work off the cost of their purchase, things like that. I think Geoff can elaborate more on this.
Yeah, there's so many challenges. Kelly was talking about with the Catholic Church, and I think generally speaking, we inherit these stories, these sort of stock stories, and they typically, they come out of a history of avoidance of the truth and an attempt to whitewash, not just like the past generation, but going back generations, and they've been recirculated over time and sort of almost refined as all the complexities washes away, and you're left with just the saint or the abolitionist founder story, where all of the complexities, it didn't require the past generation to leave things out. It was already left out generations before. Now we're in the 21st century, and you say, well, as the students have written in this piece, well, actually, it's clear that Eliot was hostile to the notion of freedom. He did not conceive of African Americans as equals politically, economically, socially. He was leader of the Colonization Society, which sought to banish African Americans. People have written about the history of these moderate abolitionists or conservative anti-slavery elements that sought essentially, as one of their contemporaries described it, two emancipations. One was to free Black people, the other was to free white people from the presence of free Black people. And we still see, just for the record, we still see white Americans struggling with the presence of free non-white people around them and finding various ways to curtail that freedom. But these stock stories of who these figures were are very difficult, and I think to overcome, in part because we want to believe so often these simpler and more favorable things about our institutions. I think also a challenge here is the impatience we can have, in this era of kind of immediate fulfillment of, like the buy now button and the thing arrives the next day. One of the ironies about WashU and slavery, I mentioned being late to the game here, is, not so much an irony, but it is an interesting issue, and one I find myself kind of pushing back against occasionally. An institution like Yale University, they had their annual symposium this year, and this is a project that's 20 years old, and they've got just a wealth of information about their institutional history that they are now responding to. And it's easy for us to watch that and think, well, why aren't we doing that? Why aren't we doing what they're doing now? And I think part of the answer is because we're really only just beginning to understand more fully, more honestly, our story. And pieces like the Student Life article and so on are really key there. But as I mentioned, there are a number of unanswered questions still in that piece. And so and then finally, in terms of challenges, it has to be said, it's maybe an obvious point, but a great challenge is that there are these silences in the archive as well. And the silences in the archive are a product in part of these selective tellings of the stories that I was just talking about. One of the things I'm really interested in, for example, is how it came to be that WashU stopped admitting African American students in the 1890s. WashU admitted not large numbers, but graduated several African Americans in its first 4 decades, and then abruptly stops admitting Black students in the late 1890s, coinciding with our move to what was then the Hilltop campus west of the city of St. Louis. What's the story there? I think it's an important question. There are some fragments of information, about, for example, the protests of white students who found it offensive to be in an institution alongside Black counterparts, African American counterparts, and they wanted the university to be segregated. But it's not clear that was the primary reason for this policy turn. But the reason I'm using this example is because it's not the kind of thing that gets documented in an archive very well. There's not a speech on our decision hereafter to be a white-only institution, or to exclude African Americans at least. But I think as we continue to do the research, we'll learn more about that kind of question and many others. But it will take time. And I don't want to be clear. I'm not saying, my point is not that we need all of the answers to all the questions before we do anything else, but that ideally our responses will be informed by, grounded in the stories, and more specifically, informed by our understanding of the harm and what exactly we should focus on repairing.
Yeah, I think you both underscored in really clear ways sort of the complexities surrounding this type of work, right? The silences in the archives, the the stock stories, right, or the stories that we tell ourselves about our past, or these myths that, are created and just maintained over decades or centuries, right? And the impatience. It's a difficult thing to work with, right? Impatience, especially when you're talking about public conversation and public facing work that's got to interface with public conversation. And this makes me think a little bit about a previous episode we did on critical race theory, right? That's been in the news now for the past more or less year. And this confusion, right, between conversations about the history of race in the United States and what was this field of scholarship primarily developed in legal studies in the 1970s and 1980s, and the total conflation that happens in some corners of public debate about what critical race theory is. And so that's a challenge when trying to engage, I guess, people from different communities, different stakeholders in what is this really critical work, right, about institutional history and the decisions that are made throughout the institution's past. And I think the example you gave, Geoff, was a great one about WashU in the 1890s. So clearly there's a lot to do for WashU and slavery, right? A lot of research and work that's going to happen. Can you all talk a little bit about what to look for in the near future with the project, student work, colleagues who are involved, administrators across the campuses?
There's a lot in the works. I think we spent one of our main focus areas this semester was just getting our website up so that we would have we'd be accessible that way. And we'll use the site to share the stories that we are gathering through the various streams of work that are connected to this project directly and indirectly. The site showcases not only WashU stories, but also related research and programming that's happening on our campus and in the wider community. So I encourage people to look at the site, keep an eye on it, watch our events page, also the resources page.
Yeah, I was just going to say for people to have the reference handy, right? It's slavery.wustl.edu, right?
Yeah, right.
Slavery.wustl.edu.
So one thing to look for is more activity kind of build out in that digital space. And there's also information there about how to get involved in the project. We'd love, for people who are teaching classes, for example, where there are opportunities for students to engage in research or creative work relevant to this project. We'd like to share that information on our website, on our teaching and learning opportunities page. And so that's one thing. Kelly and I are working with Jesse Cerruti and Olin Library to curate an exhibition called Counter Narratives on the ways that portraiture and other art forms and historical objects are useful in countering stories that are told about race and ethnicity and the misrepresentations and the disrespect and the erasure and so forth that often happens in those forums. And so the Counter Narratives exhibit will open in January and run through the spring semester at Olin and the Thomas Gallery, the main gallery in Olin. Encourage people to take a look at that. I'm really excited that CRE2 has supported an internship with Kemper Art Museum, Mildred Lane Kemper Art Museum, for a curatorial research intern focused on race, ethnicity, and equity. The Kemper Museum is similar to the library, is working to reflect critically on its collection and the sort of legacy descriptions and metadata that connect to objects in the collection and the silences in those descriptions of the collection, and thinking about how to further the research on the collection, but also to think innovatively about how to exhibit some of this work that some of the work, for example, that celebrates settler colonialism. How do you take that work and translate it in a way that makes it productive in relation to agendas like the WashU Slavery Project? So our the new intern undergraduate student working with that project, Gabi Sano, who's is going to be working there, is going to be doing, I think, some exciting work with the curators and others at the Kemper in the spring. Sorry. One other thing I want to mention, and then I'll stop here. I could just go on and on about things that are in the works, but going back to some of the things we talked about earlier in terms of partnerships and so on, several of our students have submitted proposals to present at the Missouri Conference on History. That's going to be in March in Jefferson City on a panel about Missouri universities and slavery, or slavery and higher education in Missouri. And the panel, I believe, will include, if it's accepted, students from WashU, students from William Jewell University in Western Missouri, and also, I think, someone representing University of Missouri and Columbia. So this will be, I'm looking forward to learning from these presentations, but also to just seeing this representation of the collaborative spirit of our project in Jefferson City in the spring.
Yeah, and connections taking shape, right?
Yeah.
Especially among students. That's really exciting. So thank you both so much for this conversation. It's been wonderful to have you here and to learn more about WashU and slavery. And we'll look forward to keeping this conversation going.
Thank you, Billy.
Absolutely. Thanks so much, Billy.
That is it for our show today. Stay tuned to future episodes for more on the WashU and Slavery Project, as well as critical faculty and student research that CRE2 supports. Special thanks to Geoff Ward and Kelly Schmidt, the CRE2 team, Jennifer Gartley from the Department of Music, and Ann Cleary, and the Washington University Marketing and Communications team. Original music composed by Saria Conaway, a teaching artist, multi-instrumentalist, composer, and producer who lives and works in St. Louis. Thanks for listening.